We as human beings knew how to teach effectively for hundreds, even thousands of years. It isn't as though this whole thing was discovered in 1900. And so what I would hope is that parents and taxpayers would become far less agreeable to the investment in so-called new things and realize that effective teaching has always been out there, always been available, and we ought to look at what has worked in the past and pay no mind to these suggestions about how to do things revolutionarily different in the future. In the last lecture, we sought to establish a proper understanding of education. Do note that a proper understanding of education is an ambiguous phrase. On the one hand, it can refer to the manner in which the institution or practice of education is best comprehended. On the other hand, the phrase can refer to a good education. That is to say, what ought education to do? It is this second meaning that will be prominent during this, our third introductory lecture on education. We will be studying the progressive vision for education. In doing so, we will be looking closely at the ideas of John Dewey. As I promised at the end of the previous lecture, in examining Dewey's progressivism, we will further explore the intimate connections between thoughtful educational policy and practice and the underlying social and political ideal. Progressivism offers a perfect illustration of such ties. Now, these ties I referred to last time using this diagram: educational policy or practice and social or political ideal, connected by the double arrow. As I just said, progressivism offers a perfect illustration of such ties. In the progressive educational program, social and political ideal is both cause and effect of what takes place in the classroom. Dewey is the consummate progressive. If you would like to penetrate the progressive mind, there is no better place to go. At the center of the progressive mentality is a sense of mission and responsibility that feeds a self-image of heroic action. Strongly influenced by both historicism and dominant interpretations of Darwinism, Dewey understood himself as being in the vanguard of a movement to establish intelligent action in the place of an allegedly narrow-minded, fragmented, and disorderly response to momentous social, economic, technological, and political change. This action, to be effective for Dewey, must be centralized and invested with the power of government. A moment ago I mentioned that Dewey, and by extension progressivism, was a product of historicism and an interpretation of Darwinism. I owe you some explanation of these highfalutin terms. By historicism, I mean the view that human beings always and necessarily find themselves confined, morally and intellectually, to a time and place, marked by its own distinctive way of thinking. Indeed, under historicism, how we think, including our understanding of the true and the good, is a function of prevailing circumstances. It follows, then, that what was understood to be true or good at one time is likely to be different from what is understood to be true or good at a later time. For the historicist, there is no meaningful reference to a good or true that exists outside and independent of an historical context. There are at least two significant implications of this position. First, any mention of eternal or absolute principles is the product of confusion. And secondly, principles that were appropriate and authoritative at one time should be modified or abandoned at a later, different time. Under the heading of Darwinism, I refer to the combination of several assertions. Among these are the following. First, as in the case with any organism, man, faced with an ever-changing and uncaring environment, finds himself in a struggle for existence. Secondly, there is no purpose for this struggle other than continued survival itself. And third, in order to secure its survival, man must be able and willing to adapt. So I refer to Darwinism under those three principles. Do note that because of historicism, nothing eternal or absolute can be lost in our obedience to the Darwinian imperative. In 1897, Dewey published a remarkably explicit declaration of educational principles under the heading of My Pedagogic Creed, which I have placed on the board down here. In this creed, he states, quote, "Education is the fundamental method of social progress and reform." He then elaborates with the following words, and let me read these to you. "The community's duty to education is therefore its paramount moral duty. By law and punishment, by social agitation and discussion, society can regulate and form itself in a more or less haphazard and chance way. But through education, society can formulate its own purposes, can organize its own means and resources, and thus shape itself with definiteness and economy in the direction in which it wishes to move." Those are Dewey's words. Let me just pause for a second to highlight a couple of the concepts in that passage. Do recall that he says that the community's duty to education is its paramount moral duty. I want to call to your attention the importance of this sense of mission in Dewey. And secondly, I would call your attention to his reference to more or less haphazard and chance insofar as we use non-educational means to direct our future. But his point is that through education we can take control of this process and we can shape ourselves with definiteness and economy, to use his phrase. So for Dewey, education is a tool, in our time, the primary and indispensable tool through which we can shape our future. We need to say a few words about that future and about how it is defined by Dewey in opposition to a dreaded alternative. In response to these images, progressive education takes shape. Dewey, who was born in 1859, grew up in an America that was undergoing fundamental transformation. Heretofore a largely rural and farm-based nation, the United States was rapidly industrializing. One consequence of this development was unprecedented urban populations, in large measure consisting of new immigrants who were unfamiliar with American language and traditions. Because the growth of urban population was also fueled by internal migration from countryside to city, there was, coincidental with the need to socialize and direct the energy of immigrants, a breakdown of the socializing institutions of traditional America. Surveying the world around him, it was obvious to Dewey that not only was there the new fact of deep and structural change, but the very pace of change was growing. In short, environing conditions, that's one of Dewey's favorite phrases, environing conditions were evolving radically, and if we fail to respond properly, we will experience chaos and court various forms of disaster. Among the new facts of central concern to Dewey were unprecedented concentrations of wealth and power. In his mind, these were direct threats to democracy. Precisely because these and related developments were new, existing institutions and practices would be unable to respond to them effectively. The nation, with increasing desperation, required a new and reliable source of socialization and moral training, of insight and effective action that would respond appropriately to changing circumstances, both at that time and during a future which showed every sign of additional, never-ending increasing complexity. Like a hungry chimpanzee scanning the environment in search for a tool with which to reach a banana, Dewey looked around and recognized the unique possibilities of the public school. In the face of the roiling America just described, Dewey formulated an ideal alternative. Recognizing and exploiting the possibilities offered by the revolutionary new circumstances, Dewey outlined a vision of positive and never-ending reform under the direction of informed cooperative control. For Dewey, democracy was sacrosanct. All that we do should serve the good of the many, and the many are, and should be, responsible for the direction of their own lives. But there is a gap between the way people are and the way they need to be, between the actual and the possible, that stands in the way of the ideal. It is in addressing this gap that education finds its meaning and purpose. If we would have a nation governed cooperatively and intelligently by its people, the people must understand how to cooperate and think effectively. Such behavior consists of insights, skills, and habits that must be learned. The school for Dewey is the specialized mechanism that our society, especially during these problematic times, has designed to establish the characteristics required for it to flourish. In the classroom, then, children and young people should be engaged in suitable activities. If we would have adult citizens who take responsibility, especially in sizing up problems and formulating an effective response to them, then it is necessary for the school to provide an environment that stimulates precisely those abilities. Hence, we have the familiar image of a progressive school in which the children are busily doing all sorts of things, each individual pursuing activity that he finds significant. In this connection, let me read from Dewey's description of a typical day in the school he ran at the University of Chicago in the 1890s. And once again, these are Dewey's words. There is nothing which strikes more oddly upon the average intelligent visitor than to see boys as well as girls of 10, 12, and 13 years of age engaged in sewing and weaving. If we look at this from the standpoint of preparation of the boys for sewing on buttons and making patches, we get a narrow and utilitarian conception, a basis that hardly justifies giving prominence to this sort of work in the school. But if we look at it from another side, we find that this work gives the point of departure from which the child can trace and follow the progress of mankind in history, getting an insight also into the materials used and the mechanical principles involved. In connection with these occupations, the historic development of man is recapitulated. Now, since I read a lot of words in a hurry, let me just pause and dwell on this for a moment. What Dewey is saying here is what might appear to the average visitor as trivial activity, sewing on buttons and so forth, is in fact, under the design of a skilled teacher, a mechanism through which the entire history of mankind can be learned by the young. A truly extraordinary expectation. In such a school, the teacher, understanding better than the children themselves what they need to learn, will contrive circumstances that give rise to envisioned preferred outcomes. For example, because we know that skillful cooperation in the solution of larger problems is necessary in a viable democracy, the teacher will arrange the classroom and the principal of the school such that children will, through their own volition, organize themselves and address circumstances they find problematic. Above all, the progressive school aims to teach the young to learn how to learn, and it wishes to establish a character, a sort of person, that possesses the ability and inclination to adapt thoughtfully to changing circumstance. By a similar logic, the progressive school will adopt practices in which the young will learn independent judgment as well as a sense of responsibility to the group. Rather than routinely being told what is the case and what to do, as is the case in Dewey's portrayal of the traditional school, in the progressive classroom, children will learn to see for themselves and will never bend to tradition or authority per se. Naturally, children require discipline, but discipline for Dewey will arise out of the children's activity itself. Activity, you will recall, that the child himself finds important. You might be worried that such a child-centered classroom would be chaotic and wasteful. And indeed, Dewey in later life was disgusted with educators that had employed his ideas irresponsibly to establish unorganized and permissive schools. But Dewey the progressive is very much the organizer. In the genuine progressive school, nothing is left to chance. But this is known to the teacher and administrator, not to the child. It will prove useful to place Dewey's recommendations for the classroom side by side with what for him are the two alternatives. As you will see on the matrix appearing on your screen, we can divide education into 4 areas of study. Now on the matrix, what I have done is I have given you 3 columns. The headings for those columns are the traditional school, the progressive school, and Dewey's approach. And then on the left column, I've divided education, as I mentioned, into 4 areas. The curriculum, teacher's role and method, authority, control, discipline is the third, and fourth, educational success. Now, we don't have time today to go through the entire matrix, but let me just illustrate how it will be of some value by talking about a couple features of it. If we look at teacher's role and method, for example, that's the second item on the left column, we will see that there are three different understandings of teacher's role and method corresponding to the three different environments. The traditional school here is a caricature created by Dewey. I suspect no school was ever quite so dead and conservative as the school he describes, but it is a very nice picture to contrast with the others. Under the traditional school, the teacher's role is always to take the lead. The control by the teacher is total. The teacher is an agent of the past, and I use the word imposition here for the spirit of the traditional school, according to Dewey. The so-called progressive school, now this is a kind of school that Dewey takes issue with, because he believes that the so-called progressive school typically misunderstood his ideas. The teacher's role is to eliminate barriers, enrich the environment, but basically the teacher does nothing. And so the term I use here is chance. We have no means by which to know for sure that anything in particular is going to be learned. The teacher stands back and allows things to happen. Under Dewey's approach, the teacher exercises responsibility, and in his mind, the teacher mimics nature, because nature, for most organisms, is a teaching mechanism, and if you don't learn from it, you don't survive. So the teacher in a classroom mimics nature, creates situations that gives rise to certain kinds of understandings and behaviors by the young. So the teacher selects, arranges, regulates. The teacher looks forward, and the term we could use for this environment and the teacher's role is initiation, because Dewey understands the teacher to be initiating the young into all sorts of things, though we must emphasize that the young do not realize anything is being done to them under Dewey's theory. In the last row on the matrix, I talk about success, and just a few words here. Under the traditional school, at least in Dewey's mind, success consists of possessing the facts, the very same facts that your own parents possessed when they were successful. Success consists of conformity to the past. Success consists of developing the values that are prized by adults. And of course, there are going to be proper attitudes and proper habits. Under the so-called progressive school, success is rather hard to define. Success would seem to be something like the child being uncontaminated, being in the natural condition. And we know such a child because he is curious, he's creative, he is spontaneous, he's free from inhibition, he has autonomy. All these words are thrown around quite freely in certain progressive environments, and people genuinely mean for children to arrive at this condition. Now, if you've ever run into such a child on a bus or a train, you might not be so happy about the progressive educational impact. Dewey's approach, far more sophisticated than the so-called progressive, but very different from the traditional, results in a child who is known above all else by the ability to learn on his own. The successful product of Dewey's education would be adept at problem solving. That person would have courage and confidence and would have imagination. And Dewey emphasizes to no end the importance of the development of intelligence and the ability to use scientific methods. So he calls the name he gives to the success of his chosen educational approach is the democratic scientific personality. Well, you can read the rest of the matrix on your own. I just hope that I've given you an idea of the three contrasting approaches in Dewey's mind. But do recall from our last lecture the reciprocal relation between educational practice and social and political ideal. That reciprocity is captured right here in our double arrow. Not only does the progressive school, properly understood, grow out of Dewey's social and political vision, that's one way on the arrow, the education provided by that school in turn intentionally entails an envisioned social and political condition, and that's the other arrow. For Dewey, what takes place in the classroom of the progressive school is the very model for the larger world ideally inhabited by the child when it leaves school and assumes its responsibilities as an adult. Indeed, if progressive education is successful, the social and political world must be transformed. This is because the actors in that world will be the product of a deliberate process of formation. And I cannot emphasize enough how formation is at the core of the progressive impulse, especially Dewey. Borrowing from Dewey's lexicon, precisely due to the impact of progressive education, the nation will be ruled democratically by independent and well-informed persons, suspicious of appeals to tradition and authority, who are prone to adjustment and marked by what he would call the democratic scientific personality. It will come as no surprise to learn that the success of the progressive school consists explicitly in the extinction of the conservative mind, and that progressive agenda places the highest priority on control of the public schools and obstruction of any alternative to them. For some critics, the distressing condition of education in our time is attributable to the victory of two very bad ideas, naturalism and formalism. Now, we have turned the board over so that I can present to you some of the new concepts that are relevant to the rest of my talk today. Now, the naturalism I'm referring to here is a very different concept from the naturalism I mentioned in the previous lecture. That earlier one, which we can call Naturalism 1, I defined in the earlier lecture by borrowing from John Lennox. John Lennox says that naturalism is the doctrine that there is nothing but nature. It is a closed system of cause and effect. There is no realm of the transcendent or supernatural. There is no outside. That's Naturalism 1. The naturalism that I'm referring to now, which we will call Naturalism 2, is the view that children in their learning are similar to the blossoming of a flower, that if left alone and to their own devices, young people will learn what they need to learn, and that this will take place with little effort and without conflict, overt authority, or recourse to threat, bribe, or punishment. The second idea, formalism, is the view that schools should arrange for children to practice and become proficient at certain processes, such as problem solving and critical thinking. In short, that we need not be concerned with substance or subject matter, since once they have mastered these processes, the young will be able and willing to learn whatever is useful or necessary as the relevant occasion arises. Might Dewey be properly associated with these two ideas? In regard to naturalism, Dewey has a mixed record. He certainly does not recommend that we leave children alone, or that in the classroom we take our cues from whatever interests them. On the other hand, Dewey does believe that learning that grows out of problems that are of genuine interest to the child will be, if not effortless, at least free of the artificiality and hence the drudgery of what in his mind typically occurs in the traditional school. It is clear that Dewey subscribes to what has been called the first flaw of progressivism, the belief that human beings have a mode of learning whose paradigm form is evident in the way young children effortlessly learn language and other knowledge of the world in informal settings. And that passage is from Kieran Egan, a professor in Canada. This need not, however, give rise to nightmare scenarios of the progressive classroom. There is no escape from authority in Dewey's school. Such authority will reside within cooperative problem solving. If children are busy, attending to appropriate tasks, there is, on his view, neither need nor occasion for threats, bribe, or punishment. What about formalism? As we have seen, the process of problem solving, or more technically, the exercise of intelligence in response to a problematic environment, figures prominently in Dewey's vision of education. He deeply opposes the requirement that children learn subject matter simply because someone tells them to, or because people learned that material in the past. He would certainly endorse critical thinking and the teaching of skills that, in his view, are essential to effective living. Still, Dewey was adamant that the young learn subject matter. He insisted, however, that such learning always occur in the context of the child's attempt to solve a genuine problem. Knowledge, books, and cultural heritage are always merely instrumental for Dewey. He was loath to teach children to respect authority or the past in and of itself. But this impression of a distance between Dewey and the excesses of progressivism needs to be tempered by two facts. First, Dewey's proposals have a strong tendency to be taken to dangerous extremes. And second, there is something in his position that is friendly to such extremism. Comments from three very different writers cast light on this question. First, from Diane Ravitch, we have this, and these are her words. The progressive education movement was inspired by Dewey's writings, but was not always strictly loyal to Dewey's intentions, end of quote. To this she adds an even more revealing comment, quote, Dewey sometimes chided progressive educators for going too far and following children's whims, but at other times he encouraged and lauded that very same behavior, unquote. I would add that Dewey possessed strong ideological commitments. He was scarcely alone in refraining from criticizing those on the left, lest that criticism somehow be used to support those on the right. Second, from one of Dewey's many biographers, we hear this about Teachers College of New York's Columbia University, the institution most responsible for the massive influence of progressive education in this country. And these are the words of J. Martin, the biographer. Although the students and graduates of Teachers College claimed Dewey as their mentor and inspiration, it was more for his symbolic presence and past work than for his actual involvement. They made Dewey seem to be the father of a version of progressive education that he neither practiced nor advocated. And last, we have these remarkable words from a man who was locked in vicious battle with Dewey in the 1930s, Robert Hutchins, whose name is on the board, regarded by Dewey as an arch-conservative and, because he believed in absolute ideas, an enemy of freedom, refers to Dewey as, quote, that most misunderstood of all philosophers of education. It is one of the ironies of fate that his followers, who have misunderstood him, have carried all before them in American education, whereas the plans he proposed have never been tried, unquote. Tellingly, Hutchins, in speaking of Dewey's book, Democracy in Education, which, by the way, in the mind of most progressives is his greatest work, adds this. These are Hutchins' words. His book is a noble, generous effort to solve a variety of social problems through the educational system. Unfortunately, the methods he proposed would not solve these problems. They would merely destroy the educational system, end of quote. In the end, then, we can say that Dewey unleashed something that either he could not or would not control. He bears considerable responsibility for the condition of America's schools and for the bad ideas that account for that condition. If the practices outlined so far today are the meaning of progressivism in education, what is the alternative? In the lectures to follow, this question will be addressed in relation to a variety of disciplines. I will close by drawing your attention to several treasure chests of good ideas for teaching, and I've put these on the board. These will be familiar to some of you. The 7 Laws of Teaching by John Milton Gregory, The Lost Tools of Learning by Dorothy Sayers, and The Art of Teaching by Gilbert Hyatt. Well, our time is up. I now pass you over to colleagues who will illuminate the meaning of proper education in the various core disciplines.